So, in this segment, segment 3, we'll talk about the key implications of whatever we choose as the basic relation between folk psychology and neuroscience, right, and the brain, right? And these all involve basically the self, who are you, and action and holding people responsible for their actions. So first question, who are you, right? We typically think of ourselves in folk psychological terms, right? So you think of personality traits, characters, your preferences, your plans, your beliefs, your goals, all of that sort of mental stuff. We generally think of that in folk psychological terms, which is why another name for folk psychology is common sense psychology, right? But what are these mental states, right? If you identify yourself with your personality, your character, your preferences, and so forth, right, and you have these various options about what these mental states are, then it's a really interesting question, who are you, right? In what way do you exist? And I'm presupposing here that we're not being dualists, right? A dualist would hold that, mental states, anything mental, is entirely separate, and it's a separate kind of substance from physical substance. We're not assuming that because we're assuming some sort of relation between neuroscience and psychology. There is a version of dualism in which what we have to say about neuroscience and psychology does matter, and that's a version of dualism where people will say there's a soul, and the soul may be separate and may survive the death of the body and so forth. But the mind is something that is connected to the brain in some way. Okay, so if you're a dualist of that type who thinks maybe there's a soul separate from the mind, the soul survives bodily death, but the mind does not, then what I have to say next, makes sense. If you're the other type of stronger dualist where, mind, soul, all that stuff is completely separate, then the whole issue of what neuroscience has to say about the mind/soul doesn't even make sense. It will have nothing to say, okay? So assuming either the first form of dualism where the mind does depend on the body in some way, or you are a physicalist who thinks that in some way the mind does depend on the body and there's either no soul or it too depends on the body, then the rest of this discussion makes sense, okay? So who are you, right? Well, again, we have our 3 options. The eliminativist says, well, you are your brain, right? You talk about yourself in terms of your character and your preferences and your likes and dislikes and so forth. But in fact, there's really just brain states, right? That's just sort of a loose and non-scientific and not very informative way of talking, right? The realist will say, no, you are roughly what you think you are. There may be some sorts of, revisions to these sorts of states and so forth, but basically you think of yourself in terms of your preferences and character and so forth, and those things really are realized in the brain. And the third says, well, yeah, you are sort of what you regularly do, right? So your preferences, for example, are, what you regularly choose, right? If given 2 choices and you consistently go for the one type of thing rather than the other, right? And you say, well, I prefer, right, this particular thing, right? So you prefer a color, you prefer blue rather than red, and so you always pick out the blue item rather than the red item. A quasi-realist would say, sure, right, that's a preference, and the preference is just you consistently choosing blue. It's not that there is a mental state, something in your head, right, that realizes your liking for blue. Okay, so those are the 3 options, and obviously they're pretty different, right? How you talk about who you are, right? You could be very much like what you think you are, or not at all like what you think you are. So that's the first question. In neuroscience, in cognitive neuroscience, this particular issue of the self comes through in a number of different ways. One of the most important ways, I suppose, is the question of what's called mind reading, which is the question of, can you know what you're thinking? Can I know what you're thinking by scanning your brain, right? And a particular case of this is our efforts to see if we can develop some sort of fMRI-based lie detection method. Can we know if you're lying if we scan your brain asking you certain leading questions, right? And another way is talked about actually by one of the other neural mechanisms lecturers, experiments by Adrian Owen and some of his colleagues to see if certain patients in vegetative states or minimal cognitive states are able to think in ways that can be scanned differently between thinking about playing tennis and thinking about moving about in one's house, right? And if you're scanning the brain to see if there's a difference in these things, then there's an assumption that in some sort of way we're reading the mind of the person who is in the vegetative state and able to distinguish these two different kinds of mental states. So if we ask, can we know what you're thinking by scanning your brain, right? There's actually two questions, right, which we should be able to see now, right? One is, can we do this now or in the foreseeable future, right? Will technology eventually enable us to be able to mind read through fMRI or perhaps through some other technology, right? That's one question, and that's the usual question that people will ask, right? Can we do this? Can we not? But of course, if you're going back to the question of folk psychology, then the more basic question is it even possible to know what you're thinking by scanning your brain, given what your thoughts, preferences, and character are, right? And obviously, the three different answers that we talked about, eliminativism, realism, and quasi-realism, right, will give very different answers to this second question, right? For the realist, for example, it does make sense to scan your brain to see what you're thinking. For the eliminativist, right, that really kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it certainly doesn't make sense for the quasi-realist, right? Okay, so why are we doing mind reading? Well, right, from a folk psychological perspective, it's not clear. The second, or third, I should say, is how we explain action and how we hold people responsible, right? So here, one case in point is the whole neurodiversity movement, which is in relation to autism. So advocates of neurodiversity movement, they hold that autism is a neural difference and not a disorder, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this and a lot of debate. People in the autism community are not, all of one voice on the matter. But for those who are the strongest advocates of this idea that autism is a difference and not a disorder, they often identify the cause of actions, right, with the brain, right? They'll say, the brain did it, whatever, right? And the idea here is that the self should not be blamed, right? It's the brain, right? It's not me in some sense. And so there's a tendency to slide between two different ways of either identifying the self with the brain or somehow separating the self from the brain, right? And it's not easy to discern exactly which of those they are talking about, but my point is just that if you're thinking about folk psychology and its relationship to the brain, and you think about the self in particular, then what you say, is the self to blame or is the brain to blame, right? It sort of depends in part on how you answer the question of what you think these mental states are, what you think the self is. And the final, this is a very, very, very active contemporary debate, is about free will, usually with determinism. So the idea here, again, is do you have free will? Well, ordinarily, we think we do, right? All of the actions that we've been talking about, folk psychologically explained, they all lead to the idea that you can be held responsible for what you intentionally do, for your intentional actions. If you choose to break a glass and then you do it, right, then you can be held responsible for that. Why? Because you did it freely, right? You chose to do it, right? And neuroscience has, impacted very strongly this debate about free will. In particular, one of the questions that are raised, and this is based on work by Eddie Namias, does neuroscience posit that we are somehow bypassed by our brain states? In other words, if you identify yourself with your mental states, preferences, goals, actions, and so forth, and yet neuroscience is showing that it's really the brain that's doing the stuff, right? Then it looks like yourself isn't doing it. It's the brain that's doing it. And that's the bypassing concept. So all of these different issues in terms of, who you are, can we read your mind with fMRI, right? Should we identify the self with the brain? Can you be held responsible for what you do in the way we think of? These all depend on certain views of how we think of ourselves from a folk psychological perspective, and then initially how folk psychology is related to the brain. And as we've seen, there are three very different options on the table, right, regarding that relationship. So let me just summarize where we are with the first three segments. First of all, folk psychological or common sense mental states are used to explain and predict our behavior. There may be more than that. That's the minimum. Second, we've gone through a variety of options regarding whether these folk psychological mental states are real or not, what they are, right? We've also gone through why the different options matter, right? Because we identify ourselves generally with our folk psychological mental states, right? And we're held responsible for the intentional actions that these mental states are typically used to explain. Okay, so now we get to the sort of the real cognitive neuroscientific meat of the lecture. And the final question is then, what is neuroscience telling us about these mental states, right? What is of the three options is best in the light of this evidence?